A key question of fact here, key question of fact, which is, what can you tell us about the significant event that took place last night? You had several denial of service events, but this major one, how big was it? If the system was meant to be capable of taking 260 forms per second, how big was this denial of service event? And a follow-up on that, a denial of service is usually termed an attack. So why do you claim that there was no attack when there was a denial of service?
Perhaps I can answer about the capacity. There was no issue with the capacity of the ABS system. We still were receiving forms at a rate of 150 per second. Our capacity is 260. The denial of service breached the online form because it didn't get caught up by the geo-blocking. That was the aspect in the protection system that didn't operate fully.
Can we ask Mr MacGibbon, who may be an expert on this, we're hearing words like significant and major. Can you put that in some sort of quantum for us? What are the sheer number of hits involved in these DNSs, and what typically are the motivations of those with this capacity? Typically states, are they typically hacktivist organisations?
Sure. Well, firstly, I should say I apologise for my voice today. It's not the best day for having a pretty serious cold. It's not abnormal for Australian government services to be subjected to denial of service attempts. This is just the normal course of business for government. And the vast bulk of those are handled in the normal course of business. The reason why the fourth incident was significant was because there were actually two failures. The first was a geo-blocking service fell over, and when that fails, and that's one of the main defences used against denial of service. So once we lost the capability of preventing essentially the geolocation of data coming in, then the router failed. And as a result of that, there was information inside the system that the ABS and IBM took very cautiously. So not knowing what that information was, made a decision to take it offline. So the attack was no more significant than the types of attacks we would see all the time against Australian government systems. It's just that there was a confluence of events. In terms of the motivation of people, it is important, as the Minister said, to note that a denial of service is not a breach. It's not designed to take data. A denial of service is designed to frustrate. If I can use an offline analogy, it's equivalent to me parking a truck across your driveway to stop vehicles coming in and out. That is all a denial of service is. Now, in this case, the denial of service led to other systems failing, absolutely, but it does not compromise the integrity of data.
What was the source country?
That's being investigated at the moment by the Australian Signals Directorate and others.
Minister, we've had the census night. That's passed. We've got millions of Australians that still haven't completed the census. How confident or realistic is it that we're going to get more than 98% participation rate? And if there's not, we could have the biggest census failure in 100 years. How much responsibility would you take as Minister?
Well, bear in mind the fact that I've been the Minister responsible for the ABS for 3 weeks. It is a significant role, it's an important role, and one I take very, very seriously. The ABS also is taken very, very seriously. It has bipartisan support, always has. This was the 17th census. It is ongoing. And as Mr Kalisch has informed me in briefings that I've had on this, many people, most people in fact, don't actually fill their census out on the given night. Many fill it out beforehand, many fill it after the event, and the fact that they've got now until, and always did have, until September 18 to submit their paper form and the 23rd of September to fill their online form does not change. That active grace period was always there, it still is, and I'm confident that Australians will accept the principle of the fact that the census is a vital event. I'm convinced that they know that their communities are enriched by having the proper data, the proper raw data available to governments of all political persuasion, federal, state and local, to assist with governments to be able to allocate funding and resources for roads, for rail, for hospitals and for schools and for other important government institutions and facilities.
You mentioned you've only been in the role 3 weeks. In hindsight, was it a good idea to have this massive project in the hands of a fresh minister?
Well, the census has been planned for 5 years. Indeed, planning for the 2016 census occurred before the 2011 census was actually conducted, and so you know, there's a lot of planning goes on with the census. This was the first online census as such, the third time that the census has been held online, but the first time that a real push was made for people to actually fill it out online. And you know, I still believe that more than 2/3 of people will actually fill their census out online, get those important details into the ABS to enable governments to be able to allocate funding. Shane Wright? Shane Wright.
One question, one to Mr. Kalisch. 18 months ago, the ABS actively sought to abandon the census, go to 10 years, and look at a survey. How can you argue that this has been well planned when 18 months ago the ABS was looking at something very different? And Mr. Kalisch, at 3 o'clock yesterday, you did a press conference in which you said everything's fine, and you had 2 DNS, I'll say, attacks before that. Why didn't you let people know at that time that there were issues at play with the census?
Well, to firstly answer your question, Shane, it has been well planned, of course, and all planning and strategies were put into place to prepare for any denials of service, to prepare for any event such as that occurred last night. And the good thing is, it was safeguarded. People's information was protected. The good thing is that no data has been lost. The good thing is the firewall's held up, and the actual ABS has been shown to be, whilst they've been very cautious, they've also shown to be very responsible, because no data was lost. The information is stored securely that has already been provided. The website has been pulled down until such time as people's information can be safeguarded and can be protected, and when that happens, it will be restored. Dave?
Yeah. People would not be surprised that the ABS and other agencies are subject to denial of service attacks. The issue yesterday was that they were identified and they were managed. They were managed with our risk management plan and with the strategies that we had in place. I didn't think it was appropriate for me to signal that that was happening. Certainly the issue was that we had managed it effectively, the system was operating and people could submit their forms online.
But how can you possibly say that it was not appropriate when you went out publicly with reassurances and clearly did not tell the public of significant events? And secondly, on this whole planning for a denial of service, yes, you protected the data, but the system has crashed and the whole thing has ended up something of a fiasco. Was adequate planning put in place?
During the day, there was no crash, as you call it. The protections in place worked. There were a number. There were a number of inconveniences in terms of a few minutes that the system was not available, but we had seen, I suppose, the trajectory in terms of submissions of online forms that we expected. So it was starting to build up, and then during the night it got to that crescendo.
Mr. Kalisch, can I ask, you referred on AM to a gap in the system identified by a third party to justify your decision to shut the system down. What was the gap? Is that the geolocation issue? Who was the third party that advised you to shut it down? And how serious does the threat from that gap remain? And if I could also ask Mr. MacGibbon, was this a state actor, or were these school kids on computers, Mr. MacGibbon, or don't we know? Don't we have a clue?
I suppose, as was explained by the Minister earlier, there were actually a confluence of events, so it's not fair to talk about just one dimension. There were a number of aspects. So there was the geo-blocking that didn't work effectively. There was a hardware router failure with also a supplier to us. And the other issue was in terms of the performance monitoring system, the performance monitoring information that was throwing up some queries to us that we needed to investigate.
And which third party told you about it?
So this was coming through our system in terms of the monitoring information and the intelligence that we have through IBM, that they were seeing that through another ISP that wasn't doing the geo-blocking, and then the router failure that took place with Telstra.
And Mr. MacGibbon, if I could sharpen up on this point of the extent to which you know whether this was a state actor or just a school kid on a computer, or who would have done this?
Attribution is always hard, particularly with the denial of service. By the very nature of it, you try to grab traffic from different locations, so that's being investigated at the moment.
When was ASD called in? Was it called in last night or only this morning?
Maybe David Kalisch could answer that. I'm just looking at my chronology, but
We've been working with ASD for some time in terms of when the denial of service attacks were taking place. I believe we spoke to them before lunchtime yesterday, and that they provided some advice to us, and we asked whether they had any further intelligence that we should be aware of.
Minister, can we just go back to Michelle's question there about the was adequate planning put in place? Mr. Gibbon, you did say that the attack was no more significant than others against government systems. Why then were you not prepared for what happened yesterday?
Well, I'll start with saying why I said it's no more significant. Denial of service is just commonplace for, frankly, not just government. Any big organisation online will suffer these attempts on a very regular basis. So the Australian government and all of its systems are constantly challenged for these things. And the vast bulk of the time, in the normal course of business, the denial of service is thwarted and there is no impact upon the operation of those systems. I think the point being made today is that there were a series of events that only by lining them up end on end led to the unfortunate circumstances of last night.
So were you prepared? Were you prepared, would you say then, for what happened yesterday, given they were able to, the system was shut down?
I'll leave that to the ABS if that's
well, I
all
can
right.
say that yes, the ABS was prepared. Yes, the government was prepared because the ABS has taken every responsible step to make sure that people's data, people's information was not able to be accessed by those who shouldn't have access to that information. And so they've taken the very cautious step, and I would say a responsible step, to make sure that didn't happen.
So, Mr. McCormack, was this actually an attack? Because Mr. Kalisch has just said again that it was an attack twice. You said that this morning, and then you started off the press conference by saying it was not an attack. Why are you...
Well, I'm not using the word attack, nor was it hacked, because I feel by saying attack, it looks as though, and it seems as though, and it is so, that information was then gained. There was no successful attack. The ABS, in conjunction with IBM, closed the system down such that that nothing was actually been able to been accessed by those who shouldn't have that information. So there was no hack. A hack is when somebody gets into a system, retrieves what they want, and then uses it for malicious purposes. There was no attack. There was no hack. And because that sort of information did not get out.
Given that
you're so sure on that point that no data was lost, you're going to tell the Privacy Commissioner to call off the dogs. And also, can you tell us at least where the majority of the traffic was coming from at the time of the major denial of service attack last night?
Oh, I can start if that helps. Yeah, most of the traffic was coming from the United States, but that's not abnormal in denial of service because there are an awful lot of systems in the United States. So, again, that's why the investigation needs to be undertaken to determine, if possible, who the actor or actors were. If I could just talk briefly about the concept of terminology used. I've spent the last 15 years trying to clarify with people that a denial of service is not a hack. It's not a breach, it's not a compromise, it's not an exfiltration of data. A denial of service is impeding the operation of servers and websites. That's what a denial of service is. So, as the Minister has said, there was no breach, there was no intrusion, there was no hack. This was a denial of service. The traffic was largely coming from the United States. That can vary a lot, of course, in denial of service, which is why we need to work with our counterparts offshore to determine who it was, if possible.
Doesn't this go to motivation and intention, though? And if the intention is to stop the census working, isn't that, in layman's language, an attack, whatever the language of the computing experts might be?
I don't want to get cute. It's certainly very frustrating, absolutely. But I suspect that most people want to make sure that the information, the integrity of the information remains.
What do you think the motivation would be that people don't get it?
Clearly to cause frustration, and I would say they successfully caused frustration. One thing I would say is that there was an awful lot of conjecture about the census and its online activities, and every time there is more of that conjecture, it increases the profile of the site. We see that in every single time. Whenever we talk about a breach, when we actually talk about a successful compromise, we see people trying to compromise the system we talk about. It's the same with a denial of service. It's the same with any form of IT security. The more we talk about it, the more people decide to see if they're better than we are. In this case, what I'd say is it almost ended up a draw. They managed to tip over some systems. The ABS made a decision to turn that website off in order to ensure that the data wasn't compromised. And again, I would say that the number one way in which Australians engage with the Australian government is via the internet. We do this in a whole range of ways. I did internet banking this morning, significant information that I carry out online. It's not abnormal for us to be engaging online and doing sensitive things. But there was a lot of conjecture about the ABS census, and we see the consequences of that conjecture.
And if I could just conclude by saying that it was better, it was deemed to be better last night to inconvenience Australians and to shut down the website than to compromise the data already collected and to compromise further data that may well have been collected during the period. So, as I say, the ABS has apologised for this inconvenience, but better to be safe than to be sorry. And I want to reassure Australians that their data is safe. I want to reassure Australians that they still do have time, many weeks in fact, to get online, to fill their paper forms out and to get them into the Australian Bureau of Statistics, because it is important information which will help the government, help governments of all persuasion to shape a better future for our nation. Thank you very much.
We've got more questions. Minister.
That is the Government Minister responsible for the census, Michael McCormack, along with the head of the ABS, David Kalisch, and also the Prime Minister's Cyber Security Advisor, Alastair MacGibbon, talking about the events of last night which led to the crash of that census website. Just a couple of comments there from Michael McCormack. He's saying it was a denial of service. He's not describing it as an attack because he says the site was not breached. It was the fact that the denial of service meant that it impeded the operation of the website. But he's moved to clarify and to reassure people that those who did manage to file their census data, some 2.3 million, that their data is perfectly safe. It has not been compromised.